Good morning, climbers. My topic is do the things that work. I feel ambivalent about giving this kind of talk. I prefer to teach the Bible, and I'm naturally allergic to ministry pep talks and to people who have discovered the hidden, mysterious secret of how to do ministry. We're talking about some very pragmatic, tactical things in this session, so I'll just warn you up front. I'm not going to baptize this stuff in Scripture to make it seem more true than it is. Again, I really love to teach from the Bible, but what I'm sharing today isn't drawn from the Scriptures. It's drawn from experience. I'm loath to attach some Bible verses to that kind of sharing and position it as a word from the Lord. It's not. A lot of what I'm going to share with you is just stuff I think is worth trying. Before we get started, if you're still with me, let's go ahead and slay the pragmatic ministry versus spiritual ministry beast first. If you've led a church for a while, you're probably already vaccinated against the hot new next idea in ministry. Even worse, you may have acquired natural immunity. You've been to conferences, had that eureka moment, gone home, tried it, wished you hadn't. I salute you for still being here, but know that you'll be naturally resistant to anything that sounds like, do these things, they really work. Just call 1-800, it's easy, and have your credit card ready. I'm not asking you for that. I'm just asking that you don't give up hope. There are some great new things you can learn along the way. Sift through what you hear for sure, but keep listening. Now, if you're the more enthusiastic type, I'm also excited to share these things with you. And scared. You should care about what works, not just what sounds good. I hope you don't go listening to everyone with a nifty idea, even if they have no idea to, actually grow a flesh and blood healthy church. True spirituality won't ever be the enemy of effectiveness. The same Jesus who said, this guy can come out only by prayer, also said, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. That's very pragmatic. Change locations, quiet, rest. The same Paul who said, this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, also said, to the Jews I became like a Jew. We know this one, right? Why Paul? To win the Jews. Here's spiritual Paul. I've become all things to all people. And here's pragmatic Paul. So that by all possible means I might save some. So don't listen to people who play these two off against each other. They're teammates, not enemies. It's okay, young ministers, to try to get really good at ministry. I hope you can become a deeply spiritual pragmatist. Head in the clouds, feet on the ground. Okay, so what's in this grab bag topic of do the things that work? Lots of numbers, some geeky teaching plans, and a truly nutty idea. Let's start with numbers. As a family of churches, we have a complicated relationship with numbers. Stats for us are kind of like an old girlfriend that it's a lot of fun on the weekends, but a little crazy making, and when you finally give her the slip, you just want to change your phone number. So if you really hate bar graphs, please don't start chucking the coffee cups at me yet, but fair warning, you won't hurt my feelings during this part. If you want to take a 15-minute break, just pretend you got an important call. Come on back in when you see we're done with charts and maps. I didn't intend to be the ICOC stats guy, but I was for a few years just accidentally. I launched a little website called ICO Info in, of all years, 2003, in order to collect what numbers I could from any churches still willing to give them up. Collecting stats in the ICOC at that time was right up my contrarian alley, and somehow I ended up even joining ASARB, the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies. I ran their website for a couple of years and even went to one of their annual meetings. If you think this group is fun, you should party in Louisville with some of the geekiest Presbyterians on God's green earth. I mean, the spirit of Ezra just permeated the room. I haven't been the ICOC stats guy for over 10 years now, but with thanks to Paul Ramsey and all the great people who pull the numbers together for us every year, we still have lots of annual data to work with. Back in 2013, Todd sent me 3 questions. I won't read the questions to you since I know you can read words with a font size of 200 from there. I thought they were great questions, and so I got busy creating a subset of data that included only U.S. and Canadian churches. I won't get into the weeds here. I documented all the methodology carefully. I'm happy to share that with any of you who want to replicate the analysis I'm presenting today. At the time of Todd's questions, I only used 4 years of data from 2009 to 2012. That's how far back he asked me to go, to 2009. But when Rob invited me to speak at this conference and share some stats, I thought, wow, this is great. I have almost triple the number of years to work with now, and I can do something that's very risky. I can see if the initial analysis held up. We don't often get a chance to build a model and then go back 6 years later, plug in twice as much data, and see if what we thought then still proves true. So for this conference, I built a new and improved data set using the same churches. I didn't add any new ones because I wanted to see if what we found in 2013 would hold up after adding 6 more years of data on the same set of over 150 US and Canadian churches. Here was the original finding in 2013. Nothing very surprising here. Percentage growth is, on average, highly related to church size. On the horizontal axis, I have grouped the 155 churches in the sample by size into 7 classes. On the vertical axis, average annual percentage growth from 2009 to 2012. The smallest of our churches grew, on average, about 10 to 20% a year, and the biggest churches among us, about 2%. What happens if we extend the same data out to 2018? One thing you'll notice is that every size group showed lower growth. That's because overall, our growth in the US and Canadian churches was quite a bit slower in the later years of this study, from 2013 to 2018, and all by itself, that was an important finding. We're always on the lookout for the needle in the haystack, the heartwarming good news story. But the one thing we should keep in mind is that what affects one of us probably affects us all. It wasn't just the case that large churches grew more slowly. It's that what happened to large churches, to some degree, happened to small churches too. No class size was immune from whatever it was that changed in those years. Now, this is just percentage growth. What if we look at actual numerical growth? This finding surprised me a little. Again, on the horizontal axis, we have 155 churches grouped into size classes. You'll notice we're missing the biggest group because if you think about it, even 2% of 1,000 is 20. That would rescale the chart. Plus, our biggest churches tend to have more big number volatility. Some of them can swing by hundreds of members in a single year. That distorts the averages. But when we look at the 6 smallest classes of churches, isn't this amazing? What we found was that, this is overstating, but not by much, in some ways, it doesn't really matter how large or small a church is. On average, at least, a church of any size under 250 among us added about 4 to 6 members a year. Now, this might not be counterintuitive to you if you're used to thinking numerically, but think about it. For most people, this is so surprising. Suppose I handed you a list of 10 leaders of average churches and their phone numbers and said, please call them, but don't ask them how big their church is. Just ask them how much they grew each year between 2009 and 2012. Your list is going to come back with a bunch of 4s and 5s on it, right? And then if I ask you, now, predict which of these churches have 20 members and which have 200. You couldn't do it, could you? Now, this shouldn't have surprised me because I knew that a researcher named Christian Schwartz, who wrote a book called Natural Church Development, had published a finding like this on a much larger data set, something like 50,000 churches. And his conclusion was that the average church, no matter what its size, grows by about 4 people a year. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a second, that can't possibly be true of some churches because otherwise it would have taken 250 years for the Dallas church to get to its present size. And you're right on that count. There are some really big churches among us that have had multiple years of explosive growth. But here's the big idea. Please listen carefully to this because it just astounds me how this gets missed over and over again. Those churches that grow like that are like exotic plants botanists dream of finding. Think about it. Bird watchers never come home and say, honey, I spotted a sparrow. It's always, honey, you won't believe it. I spotted a vermilion flycatcher. By far, most of our churches are sparrows. God seen, God loved, blood of Christ bought sparrows. They grow by 4 or so people a year. Some of you guys have the book Breakout Churches in your library, don't you? If you don't, let me save you $20. It's the same story. It's 13 churches, a story of 13 churches that experienced breakout growth for a multi-year period under the same leader. But here is the most underappreciated part of this book. It's in a footnote in the first chapter that explains how Tom Rainer found those 13 churches. He had a whole research team build a database of, get this, 50,000 churches. Did you catch that? Here's a how-to book written about 13 out of 50,000 churches. Breakout churches is no more a how-to for growing churches than the instructions on the back of a $20 scratch lottery ticket is a plan for retirement. These are needles in haystacks. Okay, let's get back to the graphs. This finding held up even better than the last one after we added another 6 years of data for the same churches. Growth of 2 to 4 members a year, on average, pretty much for every size class of churches. Now let's put both studies on the same graph. The blue bars are the initial 2009 to 2012 study. The orange bars are for the longer period, 2009 to 2018. Yes, overall growth was less in every class but the smallest. But the story is still pretty much the same, isn't it? How big your church is it nearly as likely to affect the number of people who are saved next year as you might think? So, what was the answer to Todd's first question? Is there an ideal membership size that produces the maximum percentage numerical growth? For sure, big churches add more members. We need big churches. Below 500, though, growth tends to be about the same if we're just counting noses. But in terms of percentage growth, small churches are where it's at. Until they get bigger, that is. And then the most natural thing that happens to a fast-growing small church is that it becomes a slow-growing medium-sized church. We don't want to believe that. So we keep whipping out the binoculars, hoping to spot a vermilion flycatcher. But listen, a flock of sparrows could deliver as much, albeit with a lot less excitement, maybe. By the way, I'm not denigrating big churches. I love them. I was baptized in the New York Church of Christ and sent to the mission field by a 2,000-member church in Hong Kong. Big churches can contribute small stuff, churches that small churches just can't. May God bless us with more big churches. But almost all the high percentage growth comes from smaller churches. I told you that the second data set had 155 churches in it and covered a period of 9 years. I didn't track those churches linearly across 9 years because that would mess up the categories. Some small churches grow into bigger classes, and a few move the opposite direction. What I was trying to measure was the effect of size on growth, not the trajectory of individual churches. So, sorry, I have to interject some methodology here for the more skeptical among us. Just tune out for a minute if this part's not interesting to you. Come back in 30 seconds. I took year pairs one at a time. In other words, if church number one in the data set was at 50 in 2009 and 55 in 2010, that was a single year pair, 50 to 55. If the next year was 55 to 57, that became a year pair. No matter how big the church got, I always went back to year pairs. Here's a church that started 1 year at this point and ended at this point. That became an entry, a line. By looking at these 155 churches over 9 years, I ended up with 1,375 year pairs of data. What do we get when we sort those 1,375 lines by percentage growth? There were 42 year pairs with 33% or higher growth. All of them in churches that had 70 or fewer members. Top of the top. There were 102 year pairs with over 20% growth. All but 4 churches with under 100 members. And in the top quartile of growth years, all the years some church somewhere in the US or Canada had over 10% growth, all the churches were less than 1,000 members. If we rank them all by size, biggest to smallest, the church right in the middle of this 10% growth, that was a good year set of churches, had 60 members. Todd's second question was even more interesting to me. Is there a critical mass at which growth begins to accelerate? That would be a sweet spot to find, wouldn't it? Hang on, young Snurwell. If you can get that thing to 100, you've got some of your best years ahead of you. Sadly, the clear answer is growth almost never accelerates with size at any size. I don't mean that churches can't add more and more people as they get bigger. We do see that. What I mean is the rate of growth almost never increases over a sustained period of years. Over the span of those years, 2009 to 2018, only 5 of those 155 churches reported growth in all 9 years. Praise God for that. I know you want to know who those 5 are, but are afraid to ask. But I'll just go ahead and say who. 3 small churches, Eau Claire, Lansing, Rio Grande Valley, and 2 large churches, Dallas and North River. That's a beautiful thing. But remember, it's rare. Forget 9 in a row. How about 7 out of 9? That's pretty good. But only 38 of the 155 churches could report any growth at all in 7 or more of those 9 years. And even if we look at those special cases, those rare churches that turn in year after year of growth, not one single church showed faster and faster growth. Only 2 churches in the database could sustain increasing growth for 4 or 5 years at a stretch, and then one of those 2 churches suffered a 6% decline in the 5th year. Generally, churches grow in fits and starts. They have good years and bad years, but over time, the rate of growth always slows down, no matter how big or small. Todd's third question was, when does a group become too large that growth begins to slow? That's a harder question to answer than it might seem on first glance. Our biggest churches seem destined to grow more slowly over time. But again, even 2% of 1,000 is way more people than a typical small church could add each year on average. So there's a good news, bad news answer to this question. As churches grow, the rate of growth falls off sharply. That's the bad news. But the good news is, on average, it doesn't drop off much after a certain point. That's why some of our big churches can just keep chugging along. They contribute an outsized amount of our numerical growth given their small number of congregations. And more good news, big churches are just as likely to grow in any given year as small churches. Small churches grow faster, but they're just as likely to have the same ratio of growth years to setback years as big churches do. So we do see churches hitting the brakes once they pass 25, and then again at 50, and then again around 150. 150 appears to be an especially hard level to keep growing at. Some do and become large churches, but most at best will continue to grow slowly at about the same number of additions each year as when they were smaller. This has big implications for us as a family of churches. And so now I want to bring in a little bit of that ARB experience I told you about. I just so happened to be there at the right time because they were putting together their massive decennial survey of religious affiliation in the U.S. for 2010. I know it's 2021. They're still working on the 2020 survey. This kind of research is very different from polling. Most of what you hear in the news about the state of religion in America is from polling. You ask a random sample of people, do you go to church? What church are you part of? You write that on your clipboard and extrapolate those 1,000 answers to 330 million people. This kind of study is a much different approach. It's bottom up. You gather all the different group stats people who can tell you how many people they think are in their churches and where they're located and how many of them actually show up on Sunday. So for the 2010 study, here's the map we created for the ICOC. Then we were 126 congregations in 149 counties with 42,000 adherents. By the way, the 42,000 number is higher than our membership because it counts all the kiddos and teens who are coming with their families too but haven't been baptized. It's not fair if the Catholics get to count sprinkle babies and we don't just because we have a different doctrinal position. Fair is fair. Fair is fair. I want to show you five more maps of other groups. It's hard to find anyone exactly like the ICOC to compare ourselves with. Who else, after all, is spread all across the country, mostly in bigger cities, with relatively few members, but also well represented throughout the nation. But I picked these 5 that I'm going to show you because they more or less share our evangelical bent, and they are, at least relative to the big mainline denominations like Methodist and Episcopalian, somewhat newer to the U.S. religious scene, and they also have a national scope. Before I show you those 5 other maps, I want to call your attention to something special about this one, our map. Every county shaded blue. Blue in the legend means only 1 or 2 churches in that county. Now, this map is not entirely accurate, but it's a pretty fair depiction of something unique about us. In almost every place in the U.S., wherever we have a church, that church is led by a leader or a team of leaders. Even if they're multi-site, they usually function at some level as a single church in that place, 1 per place. But what you'll see in the next few maps is just how unusual this is. The Christian Reformed Church isn't a very big group. They're only in twice as many counties as us, but look at where they are. In many places, they have 10 or more churches in the same county. That's one reason they're 5 times bigger. The next group like us is a breakaway group. Calvary Chapel came out of Foursquare Gospel, a Pentecostal group, not much more than a decade before what we mark as the beginning of the Boston movement. They don't report membership, but notice, even though they have about 10 times as many congregations as we do, they aren't in 10 times as many places. And about half the places where they have some presence, they have 3, 5, even 10 congregations. The next group is, like us, more international than American. The Nazarenes are about 20 times bigger than we are in the U.S., but have almost 50 times more congregations. There's only one way you can have over 5,000 congregations in the U.S. You have to have more than 1 church in many counties. And what about our cousins in the Restoration Movement, the Churches of Christ? In the places they're the strongest. You can drive through 25 contiguous counties with at least 20 congregations in every county. Finally, the Assemblies of God, one of the largest American Pentecostal groups, present in over 2,500 counties. That's really impressive. But look at the number of congregations. On average, almost 5 congregations in every county they are in. I don't know if you see this as a feature or a bug, but whatever side of the one city, one church thing you come down on, we are really, really unusual in this way. I don't know of any Christian group of significance in the U.S. with fewer congregations than counties it's present in. It's almost like a rule. Either you're small and have a single congregation here and there, or you're big and have lots of congregations in many of the cities you're in. To my group, to my knowledge, no group has ever been able to reach 100,000 members in the U.S. while confining themselves to one church per metropolitan area. No one. I'm not trying to start an argument here. That's a little disingenuous. I'd like to start a righteous argument full of love and tolerance for different viewpoints, okay? Do you realize that we are more distinctive on this one issue of one church, one city than any other thing we do or believe? We're a minority in what we teach about baptism, but there are, in fact, lots of other groups, big and small, who teach the same thing. What we teach about inspiration of the scriptures, role of women, discipling, name it. We might be in the minority, but not like we are on this one. Do we really want this to be our most distinctive thing? It gives us a very strange profile. The title on the left-hand chart is a typo. It should say congregation size. Our average church size is big. One reason we small church leaders have a conference of our own is because of this. In other groups, the small church conference is pretty much the same thing as the whole church conference. In the ICOC, we punch way above our weight in congregation size compared to our aggregate size relative to others. But instead of imploring us to break our self-imposed one city, one church constraint, I'd rather go to something I think we can all agree on. We sure do need a lot more small churches. Do you want to guess how many 50-member churches we need, more 50-member churches we need, just to get to something like the middle of this pack here? 105 more. Think of those as 105 missing churches from this conference. At least twice as many small churches as we have now. Whether we plant them in places we already have churches or in new places, we should want a lot more small churches if we want to have a bigger impact. Okay, one more map, and we're done with numbers. I just want to leave you with this one. Earlier, I mentioned how this study was bottom-up, not a poll. If you read the polls, you might wonder, where are all these so-called religious people in America? I see lots of church buildings, but on campus and at work, it sure seems like there are a lot of non-religious people. Sure enough, when you ask the people who keep tabs on their own church's memberships, it's a different story from the polls. Red counties, in this map, they're right in the middle when it comes to affiliation. About half the people in those red counties, kids included, are on someone's membership roll somewhere. The yellow counties have a lot of affiliation, but there aren't many of them, and they're generally not very populous. But look at all the blue. In these places, only about a third or fewer people are claimed by all the religious groups combined. We think of the big cities as secular, but look, wide swaths of Northern California, big parts of Idaho and Arizona, even places in Florida, Ohio, big chunks of West Virginia and Maine. Millions of people just floating out there, loose in hundreds of counties. We're unlikely to ever have very big churches in many of these places, but if we were there now, how many of these millions of unaffiliated people could we draw into the kingdom of God, 50 or 100 at a time? That's all for the numbers part. Let's take a break.